Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. My name is Leon Jones, and tonight I'm going to get into something more on a civics level. Normally, I would be doing politics this time, but this is part of politics. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is an overview on how the process of the budgeting is produced. Because you hear a lot of numbers in the government about we have $6 trillion for Medicaid, we have $4 trillion for transportation. Now you have two types of spending. You have your mandatory spending that features your Social Security and your Medicaid. And then you have your discretionary spending, which that's for your Department of Health and Human Services and your transportation. So let me share my screen and actually tell you what all of this means. And we're dealing with the federal budget, but the same thing happens on the local level and on the state level. So when we deal with the federal budget, it basically serves several purposes. It's the annual request to Congress for appropriations actions on existing or new programs and changes in tax legislation. So basically, the federal budgeting process is a year-long cycle involving the president's proposal, congressional budget resolutions, and 12 appropriations bills to fund government functions. Now, it runs from October 1st to September 30th, starting with agency requests and leading to enacted laws. Key stages are formulation, action, execution, and audit. Now, the key stages of the federal budget process are formulation, that's the president's budget, where federal agencies submit requests to the OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget, which helps the president formulate a budget proposal sent to Congress in early February. Then you have your congressional action. This is where your Congress is going to review the proposal. They're going to pass what we call a budget resolution, and it's going to define overall spending limits. And it breaks everything down amongst the 12 appropriations subcommittees. Again, you always hear congressional action, and that's when Congress is always going to review. Now, who's Congress? That's your Senate and that's your House. And they will review the proposal. They're going to pass a budget, what we call a budget resolution, and it's going to define the overall spending limits, and it's going to break down this amongst the 12 appropriations committees. Then you have your appropriations bills. This is when your House and Senate develop 12 individual bills to fund specific government areas. Now, if these bills are not passed by October 1st, now October 1st is the next fiscal year. Then what happens? Then Congress must pass what we call a CR. A CR is a continuing resolution. And the reason why they passed the continuing resolution is to avoid a government shutdown. Now, earlier, there was a government shutdown for 40 days. And now you have I don't call it a government shutdown, but you have the Department of Homeland Security, they're not being paid. But it's not the 40-day government shutdown, and that's because the Democrats wanted the Republicans to pass programs or pass spending for illegal immigrants. And that wasn't going to fly with the Republican majority Congress. And then you have your execution and audit. And that's where agencies receive funds and apportionments from OMB to operate. Then you have the GAO. The GAO is the Government Accounting Office. And what they do, they basically audit the expenditures. Now, the key concepts for presentation are you have authorization versus appropriation. Now, authorization is going to create the program, it's going to set the ceiling on the funding, while appropriation actually provides the funding. And then you have your discretionary versus your mandatory. So when you deal with your discretionary spending, that's always decided on an annual basis. And that's where your defense and your education come into play, where your mandatory spending is always determined by law. And that's where you come up with the social programs such as Medicare and Social Security. Now, why is Medicaid not included? Well, Medicaid is not included because Medicaid is actually mandatory spending for all of the states. And I'll get into that in another video. So now the key documents for the key concepts are the president's budget requests, budget resolutions, and of course, continuing resolutions. Now, I'm going to get into the PowerPoint and I'm going to give you a bigger picture on what's going on. I mean, this is educational only, but this is what they're not teaching you in school. Now, of course, this is going to be an example of one of the agencies, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Now, I'm going to talk about the federal budget process. Now, when we deal with the federal budget process, what we're dealing with is the federal budget serves several purposes. You have your annual request to Congress for appropriations, actions on existing or new programs, and changes in tax legislation. Then you have your economic document reflecting spending and revenue policies. And then you're going to have a report to the public on the proposed government operational budget for the upcoming year and accomplishments from the previous year. Okay, the budget process consists of 4 phases. You have your budget formulation, your congressional action, your budget execution, and your performance review and audit. Now, it takes more than 2.5 years to work through the entire process. Now, you have your budget formulation timelines. The spring, that's when agencies compile their budget priorities. June and July, agencies submit budgets for departmental or department review. August, September, departments submit budgets to the OMB. Fall and winter, OMB provides passback and agencies finalize congressional justifications. And then February and March, the president's budget is submitted to Congress. Then you have your congressional action. This is where the House and Senate committees develop budget resolutions with the goal of providing spending limits or allocations to the appropriations committees by April 15th. Concurrently, House and Senate appropriations committees hold hearings on the budget with executive branch officials. And then House and Senate appropriations committees complete markups of all appropriations bills, usually in May and June. And then the full House and Senate vote on each of 13 appropriations bills. Now, once the appropriations bills are passed in the House and Senate, representatives from each form conference committees to work out the differences in their individual versions with the goal of completing the appropriations bills and sending them to the president for signature by October 1st each year. Now, when the next fiscal year, and that's when the next fiscal year begins. Remember, in the federal government, the fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th, and then the next fiscal year starts. So, as I mentioned to you before, if the appropriations bills are not passed and signed by the president by October 1, Congress passes a short-term continuing resolutions. That's known as a CR to fund the government at the previous year's level while they continue to work on appropriations bills. And then we have budget execution. Now, once the appropriation acts are passed and signed by the president, OMB then will work with the cabinet agencies to prepare apportionments that document the funding each agency receives in the correct categories for the time period and purpose. Then OMB is going to sign the apportionments. And then once that happens, agencies then receive Treasury warrants. And then after that, agencies begin the internal allocation processes. Now, since we generally begin each year under a continuing resolution, most programs and work units are already operating with preliminary allocations, but they may need to adjust their plans once the appropriation is passed and they receive updated allocations. Now, agencies obligate funds in accordance with the funding levels and directives in the House and Senate reports, basically accompanying the Appropriations Act. Now, again, you hear all this language on television, and I'm giving it to you for free. What I just said, the agencies, they obligate the funds in according with the funding levels and the directives in the House and Senate reports that are going to accompany the Appropriations Act. Then agencies react to unanticipated events, supplemental requests, reprogramming, or the emergency transfer of funds. And then you have financial and performance reporting. And that's when monthly status of funds at all levels of the organization, quarterly financial reports at agency and department levels, and year-end closeout for all levels. And then you have your quarterly reports, and they're going to be based on what we call KPI. KPI is what we call key performance indicators, and there's also going to be high level strategic reviews. And then finally, we're going to have the internal audits by the Office of the Inspector General. That's the OIG. And what the OIG does, they're going to report to the agency head. I'm going to focus on efficiency, economy, and effectiveness of the agency. And then there are going to be external audits by the government accounting office. You've heard the acronym GAO. That's where the audit, evaluation, and that's where the investigations come from. In fact, the GAO is actually the investigative arm of the Congress. Got one more PowerPoint for you so you can get an idea on how all of this works. And this is an education for you. Again, you need to learn about the federal budget because a lot of us don't know how it works. And this will also help you learn your own budget. So let's get into it. We're going to warm up. Now we're going to talk about fiscal policy. What is fiscal policy? Well, fiscal policy is a government policy for dealing with the budget, especially through taxation and borrowing. Now, what are some different theories concerning fiscal policy? You have your Keynesian theory. The Keynesian theory is an economic theory that believes it is the government's job to smooth out the bumps in business cycles. Intervention would come in the form of government spending and tax breaks in order to stimulate the economy, and government spending cuts and basically you're going to have tax hikes in good times, and that's to curb inflation. Again, that's called the Keynesian theory. So what's going to happen during the bad times? you're going to get what we call some tax breaks. In the good times, you're going to get spending cuts. So you want to curb deflation with one, and that's the tax breaks, and inflation with tax hikes and spending cuts. That creates a balance. Now, this all came from FDR's programs during the Great Depression. And you hear this all the time on the news about what's going on fiscally. Well, many people don't even know what's going on fiscally. They just hear what they want to hear. I'm giving it to you free. This is real economics right here. And here's another one that you're going to hear about, supply side theory. That's an economic theory that involves the reduction of tax rates, and it's going to encourage more earning, savings, and investment, and thereby going to expand economic activity and the total taxable national income. So, in other words, when you reduce tax rates, and what are tax rates? Well, you have tax rates. We have a progressive tax system in the United States. So when you have more money in your pocket, what do? And I'm using some common sense. Well, you're going to earn more. That means you're going to keep more of your money. You can save more, and then you can also spend more, but then you have more to invest. And what all of that does, it basically expands economic activity, because the economy works different ways. It works on the market, how much you spend. This is why a socialist economy doesn't work, because the more taxpayers you have, and if you tax them at a sensible rate, now I believe in a flat tax, because everybody is going to pay the same flat tax. And then I hear the Democrats talking about, well, the 1% don't pay their fair share. Well, they're going to pay the same amount. Like, say we have a 8% flat tax. Well, they're still going to pay more, although it's going to be 8% because they make more. Now, this is something, when we talk about the supply side theory, this is something that came from the 1980s during Ronald Reagan, called Reaganomics. Now, this is what people don't like about capitalism. Does it trickle down? No, but the supply side theory is known as the trickle down theory. Now, what are automatic stabilizers? Well, based on Keynesian ideas, these are government programs that operate regardless of economic conditions and are intended to keep a minimum standard of living in the United States. There are your unemployment insurance. So when you get terminated from your job, what individuals don't know, corporations pay for unemployment insurance. Then for unemployment insurance, let's say the employee is laid off for a particular reason. They'll get a percentage of their salary. It could be 75% of what they made working for the company. But that's unemployment insurance. Then there's welfare payments. Then there's Medicaid. And then there's a progressive income tax. And of course, Social Security. Now, when we look at the progressive income tax, you always hear the Democrats saying tax cuts for the rich. Well, if we have tax cuts, the rich are going to get more. Well, let me tell you something. A tax cut means the government is not getting as much revenue that they were getting before, but the government is not in business to have revenue because they're not a business. The government provides services, they're agencies, but there is also a lot that goes on when it comes to government spending besides the programs. And one of the biggest factors when it comes to these government programs is you have to pay your employees. When it comes to any business, labor is the biggest expense, and government is included. This is why if you go and get a government job, government has certain positions. In the Navy, we call them billets. Well, if there's no need for a position, they cut that position out. Employees are also given raises. I'm talking about government employees based on the budget. You also have a budget going out for private contractors. But this is where individuals have to understand that government mismanages a lot of money. This is why you have to watch some of the bills that are passed. There's a lot of fat in those bills. But basically, the Keynesian ideas, they help stabilize the economy. That's why you have your unemployment insurance, your welfare payments, your Medicaid, your progressive income tax, and of course, your Social Security. Then we talk about the federal budget. What is a budget? Well, it's a blueprint of how the government will raise and spend money for the federal government during the fiscal year. What is the federal government's fiscal year? It's a period that runs from October 1st to September 30th of the following year. Example, 2012 fiscal year ran from October 1st, 2011 to September 30th, 2012. Now, who proposes the budget? The president proposes the budget by the first Monday in February, and that is required by law. Now, Congress is also part of the budget. That's right. And this is where we always have the contentions with Congress, the House and Senate. Well, we talk about who controls the purse strings, and it's Article 1, Section 8. Congress, particularly the House of Representatives, they control the purse strings. Again, the House of Representatives, they control the purse strings. They do. So once the president proposes a budget, Congress passes a budget resolution which totals revenue and sets targets on spending. So what does Congress spend the revenue on? Two types of spending. You have your mandatory spending. That's the spending that does not need any annual approval. And what is part of that? This is where I said your Medicare, your Social Security. The reason why it's mandatory, because it's under law. Now, discretionary spending is a horse of another color. This is where you get into the fiscal year, and this is where the spending needs to be approved by Congress each year. And it is set by various House and Senate committees. Now, under the discretionary spending, some of the agencies you have are the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Transportation. And this is what's going on now. You have the contention between the Democrats and Republicans, because the Democrats really want programs for the illegals, but the Republicans don't. So what the Democrats are doing is they're saying no to any discretionary spending for the Department of Homeland Security. But what the Democrats fail to recognize is the Department of Homeland Security is going to get paid anyway. Why? Because it's already in the bill that passed called the Big Beautiful Bill. The Department of Homeland Security is funded till the year 2029. But the Democrats didn't know that, and they don't want you to know that. But I'm telling you, this is why you need to learn civics, and you're learning it free right here on the 401 Talk Zone radio show. Now let's talk about spending again, so you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Under spending, the mandatory spending, you have your Social Security Well, you do have your Medicare. You have your Medicaid as well. And here's something I disagree with as well. Congressional salaries. Congressional salaries should go under discretionary spending. And my opinion about the government, if Congress cannot come to any agreement on funding, they shouldn't get paid. You shouldn't go without paying TSA or ICE. No, you should go without getting paid if they don't get paid. But again, mandatory spending. I want you to listen up. This is where your Social Security is. This is where your Medicare is. And I'm making a correction because I said because the states do have their own version of Medicaid as well. The states have their version. But looks like the federal government has their version as well. So again, under mandatory spending, there's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, congressional salaries, and your food stamps or EBT. Now, under discretionary spending, it's a whole different program here because this is spending that goes to the agencies like agriculture, commerce, justice and science, DOD, which is the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, financial services, Homeland Security, the Department of the Interior, your Department of Labor, the Department of Health and Education, your legislative branch. Now, we talk about congressional salaries, but who's in the legislative branch? Now, I'm just going to take a wild guess at it. When we talk about the congressional salaries, it looks like it is a base salary. That's what I believe that congressional salary is. But when it comes to the legislative branch, that's your Congress. That's your legislative branch. So, because it's under discretionary spending, and this is why the Congress, if there's a government shutdown, always gets paid because their salaries are under mandatory spending. And this is where government can hook you. You say, well, government shouldn't get paid. Well, you have your congressional salaries under mandatory spending, but your legislative branch, which is your Congress, anybody who makes law, they're under your discretionary spending. So basically, the mandatory spending, the Congress gets their base salary. But if they have extra monies allotted, and also the legislative branch, it could be to pay for the staff working for the congressional personnel. That's another way to go with it because Congress people or legislators just don't work in an office by themselves. They have staff working for them. So that's where those monies are going to. So Congress is always going to get paid. It's the staff of the Congress. And see, when I even do my own videos, I learned something when you put common sense together. So that's where the discretionary spending goes when they say legislative branch. They mean your congressional staffers. Then you have your military construction and VA Veterans Affairs, your state and foreign operations, and your transportation, housing, and urban development, your Department of Transportation, and of course, HUD. Now, your appropriations bills. Before the government can spend discretionary money, Congress must pass separate appropriations bills. These bills follow the normal bill to law process. Revenue. Where does the money come from? Very simple. Taxes, individual income taxes, payroll and social insurance taxes. And your Social Security taxes, we call them Social Security taxes. They pay for Social Security and Medicare. Then you have your corporate's profits tax. Then you have your excise tax. Now, what are excise taxes? It's your gasoline tax and your tobacco taxes. Then you have your other, that's your state taxes. And then if you enter a federal park, it's not a tax, but it is a fee. And if you look at the pie graph here, and this is 2011, you'll see that the majority of the money comes from individual income. And then Social Security gets the next portion of it. Then corporate taxes, and then other is your estate taxes, and then your excise taxes. Then you have expenditures. What does the government spend its money on? Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, defense. And your defense is Homeland Security, your Department of Defense, that's your armed forces. Interest, pay interest on money the government has borrowed. That's called debt. And if you look at the pie graph, you look at the majority of the spending goes to Medicare and Medicaid, followed by Social Security, the Department of Defense. Then you have discretionary. Then you have other mandatory, and then net interest. Now, managing the economy. Now, here's what you need to know. When we talk about managing the economy, you have to ask yourself, well, what's a balanced budget? Well, a balanced budget is when revenue equals expenditures. So, unlike many states, the federal government isn't required to have a balanced budget. You know why? Because basically the government has a lot of wasteful spending, and then they'll tell you, well, we have emergency spending. They're moving money in a lot of directions. So basically, when it comes to government, this is why they always have debt. They don't have revenue. Because again, if you really think about, well, what would be revenue of government? It would be taxes. But a lot of the money goes out the door, particularly to foreign countries. And that's both parties doing it. Goes out to contractors. But when it comes to states, they always try to balance budgets. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what is a surplus? It's when the government spends less than it collects. Now, do you really believe that? Sometimes they could be overtaxing the people. That's what really happens. I had to reverse it. So when they're spending less than it collects, then that means they have too much money. That means they need to give some of it back to the taxpayers. Will they? No. Managing the economy. And here's what the government does do. This is why we have debt. What is a deficit? When a government spends more than it collects. What happens when the government runs a deficit? Well, it must borrow money to pay its bills. And they keep borrowing money. This is why the government is always going to be in debt. And how does the government borrow money? It sells bonds, which they're basically contracts to repay the borrowed money plus interest at a future date. Now, why all this talk of deficits? Now, this was back in 2010 and 2011. Well, here's the chart. It tells you what the debt is. It tells you who had the most debt. And if you look at who had the most debt, you're under Clinton, believe it or not. Clinton actually had a surplus. And his was in the billions. Reagan and Bush had deficits. In fact, Obama had some of the worst deficits. Now, even Trump, he had deficits as well. But you have to look at 2010 to 2020, that decade, those are projections. But this is how you read everything. GDP, gross domestic. That's based on GDP, current GDP. Gross domestic policy, I believe. Now, where do these deficits come from? I'm not a fan of the New York Times, but the deficits can come from a recession. Now, here's what the New York Times says. It comes from tax cuts. Deficits do not come from tax cuts. That's just money that you've never received. That's not a cut. You just never received that money. But see, the Democrats will call it a cut. Now, when you have TARP and Medicare prescription drug coverage, that's spending. Then you have wars. That's where you get your deficit. And then tax cuts. No, a tax cut is not. And this is what the New York Times. This is why I tell you all, you go back and look at my videos on propaganda. Do not listen to the New York Times. The stimulus bill. A lot of the spending is also on projection as well, but you have to look at the trends. But again, recessions, well, if you look at the recessions, what happens during recessions? Well, you have some people that raise their prices, and a lot of people can't afford to buy anything. So you don't have a lot of business activity going on because products are too high. Gross domestic product, that's GDP, gross domestic product, not policy, product. But how do you know when we have a recession? I guess they claim that if you have 2 quarters back to back, that's a recession. But tax cuts, that is not contributing to a deficit. A deficit is spending more than you make. Deficit, tax cuts, that's money that you're not getting. Remember that. And when you extend tax cuts, that's not contributing to a deficit. It's the spending that contributes to the deficit. You're always in the red. And then new policies proposed by Obama, like the stimulus bill. So that's examples. Then you have the Boyle-Simpson Commission, officially called the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. That was created by President Obama in early 2010 to identify policies to improve the fiscal situation in the medium term and to achieve fiscal sustainability over the long run. It was chaired by Erskine Bowles, former chief of staff for President Clinton, and the UNC system president, Alan Simpson, former senator. And there was a released report on December 1st, 2010, which called for deep cuts in domestic and military spending, gradual increase in federal gasoline tax, limiting tax breaks, increased Social Security eligibility age, increased Social Security eligibility age, Social Security benefit cuts. So when all this was projected, it failed to garner enough votes from all 18 commission members to be officially endorsed by the commission. There was a report, but it wasn't official. And then finally, group roles. You have the chair. The chair moderates group discussion, keeps everyone on task, makes sure that everyone has an opportunity to participate and will present the proposal at a press conference. The chair's voice counts twice in the event of a tie. Then you have the clerk. The clerk takes notes of the group's discussion, transcribes the group's proposals onto the poster, and records the group's questions for the press conference. Then you have the secretary. The secretary basically solicits votes from each group member and keeps a tally of votes, also fills in the boxes by using two separate colors, one for spending and one for revenue. And it's going to indicate the final spending cuts and revenue increases at the top of the get a pencil. You're tackling the deficit handout. It assumes the role of timekeeper if one is unavailable. Then you have your researcher. Now, the researcher should use the explanation of spending, revenue options, and other resources to answer questions that may arise throughout the discussion. Note, do not make any marks or take any notes on the explanation of spending, revenue options handouts. Tell you use the bottom of the sheet. So you get a sheet. Then a timekeeper is optional. The timekeeper is responsible for monitoring the time remaining and assisting the chair in keeping the group on task. And again, when we deal with budgets, again, as I share my screen again, budgets are very, very critical. Again, the federal budget serves several purposes: annual request to Congress for appropriations, actions on existing or new programs, and changes in tax legislation. Now, the federal budgeting process, again, is a year-long cycle involving the president's proposal, congressional budget resolutions, and 12 appropriations bills to fund government functions. It runs from October 1st to September 30th, starting with the agency's request and leading to enacted laws. Key stages are formulation, action, execution, and audit. Now, the key stages of the federal budget process: the formulation, that's the president's budget. Federal agencies submit requests to the Office of Management and Budget, which helps the president formulate a budget proposal sent to Congress in early February. Then you have your congressional action. Congress reviews the proposal, passes a budget resolution defining overall spending limits, and breaks down among 12 appropriations committees. Then you have your appropriations bills. This is where you have the House and Senate. They develop 12 individual bills to fund specific government areas. If these aren't passed by October 1st, then Congress must pass a continuing resolution to avoid government shutdowns. And then you have your execution and audit. This is when agencies receive funds and apportionments from OMB to operate. Now you have the GAO, the Government Accounting Office, or the Government Accountability Office. They then, at a later time, audit the expenditures. So, the key concepts for presentation. Then you have your authorization versus appropriation. Authorization creates the program and sets the ceiling on funding, while appropriation actually provides the funding. Discretionary versus mandatory. This is all under key concepts for presentations. Well, when we deal with discretionary versus mandatory, discretionary spending is decided annually. It's where your defense and your education are, while mandatory spending is predetermined by law. That's where your Social Security and Medicare are. Key documents: President's budget request, budget resolutions, and of course, the continuing resolution. And what you have here is, this is what we call the federal budgeting process. And that concludes this topic right here on the 401 Talk Zone radio show. Again, it's very important that you understand budgets and how they work. And all I've given you was a quick overview, and this needs to be taught in schools because it's very important. And understanding the budgets also makes you more informed as a voter. A lot of people are not informed as voters. This is why they vote for something that they don't understand or they think it sounds good. Everything is free everybody that wants something free, free is not always good. Just remember that. And again, that's my commentary for this edition of the 411 Talk Zone Radio Show right here on YouTube. If you like what I just presented, please comment, share, and subscribe. And if you're looking for some STEM content, you check out my second channel, the QCIS channel. On that channel, give you a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and of course, math. Now, here's where you can find me. 411 Talk Zone Radio Show. This is my main channel. You can find me right here on YouTube, ex formerly Twitter, Truth Social, and Rumble. And for the QCIS channel, you can find me right here on YouTube, ex formerly Twitter, and LinkedIn. And once again, keep your head high, don't be jealous, and don't be offended. But if you are offended, you need to listen to this. And if you are jealous, you need to listen to this. Always be blessed for what you have. Don't worry about what you don't have. Know that the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. If it doesn't apply, then let it fly. But if the shoe fits, wear it. And if you don't like the shoe, just change it. And once again, thank you for listening to this edition of the 411 Talk Zone Radio Show right here on YouTube. Till next time, my name is Leon Jones. I want you to have a wonderful and gracious evening. God bless you. I'm out.